I'm Olivia Hayes, and 3 days ago I found out my husband wasn't in Chicago for a business trip. He was at the altar, marrying my best friend. He planned everything, every lie, every cover story, but there was one thing he never saw coming: me. This isn't just about betrayal, it's about power, deception, and the truth they never thought I'd uncover. What would you do if the person you trusted most became your greatest enemy? Let me know in the comments. The message glowed on my phone screen, its letters sharp against the dim interior of my car. St. Patrick's Church, 2 p.m. You need to see this. An unknown number. I stared at it, my fingers clenched around the steering wheel, my breath shallow. Outside, rain streaked the windshield, blurring the gray afternoon into an impressionist painting of stone and light. St. Patrick's loomed ahead of me, its towering presence as cold and unyielding as the suspicion curling in my gut. I shouldn't be here. I should be in my apartment, curled up with a book, pretending that my husband was exactly where he said he'd be. Chicago in meetings, networking, making deals. That was what the itinerary in his suitcase had said. That was what his secretary confirmed. That was what my own damn calendar showed. But I was here, and I wasn't alone. Through the rain-speckled glass, I watched as guests streamed through the church doors, their silhouettes blurred by the drizzle. Umbrellas snapped shut, laughter echoed in the damp air, and somewhere inside, an organ swelled to life. A wedding. Not just any wedding. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, my knuckles white as I forced myself to move. The cold air hit me first, then the sound, the soft murmur of voices, the rustle of expensive fabrics, the rhythmic toll of the church bells marking the hour. 2 p.m. I stepped inside through the side entrance, my heels clicking against the stone floor, my heart slamming so hard against my ribs I could taste copper on my tongue. I slid behind a marble pillar, pressing myself into the shadows as my gaze swept the altar. And there he was, Ethan, my Ethan. Standing at the altar, his broad shoulders squared in a tuxedo I had never seen before. His hands were clasped in front of him, his familiar nervous tick, the slight twitch in his left index finger, betraying him. Not in Chicago. Here. Waiting. For her. The bride appeared at the entrance, bathed in the glow of stained glass. My breath caught in my throat as the weight of betrayal slammed into me, knocking the air from my lungs. Sophie, my best friend, the girl who used to sneak into my bedroom during thunderstorms, the woman who held my hand through my wedding vows 7 years ago, the person who helped me pick out my own dress. I gripped the pillar for support, my nails biting into the cold stone. This isn't real. It can't be real. But the music swelled, and Sophie walked forward step by step, her veil trailing behind her like smoke. Guests turned, smiling, their faces beaming with the kind of joy that made my stomach churn. My husband was marrying my best friend, and I was the only one who wasn't supposed to know. The priest's voice cut through the air, calm and practiced. "Do you, Ethan, take Sophie—" A sob clawed at my throat. I couldn't do this. I turned sharply, my heels scraping against the floor, the sound lost in the hum of vows and whispered admiration. My legs carried me before my brain could catch up, my vision tunneling as I pushed through the heavy doors and stumbled into the open air. Cold rain lashed against my face. I gasped, chest heaving, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them against my stomach to steady myself. A black town car was parked near the curb, its back window cracked open just enough to let out the scent of expensive cologne. A man in a dark suit leaned inside, speaking into a phone, his gaze flicking to me before he turned away. I didn't care. I didn't remember walking to my car. I didn't remember how my keys ended up in my hands, how I started the ignition, how the road blurred beneath me as I sped through the city, past honking taxis and blinking streetlights. But I remembered the moment I decided. This wasn't over, not even close. By the time I reached our apartment, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the city coated in a thin sheen of water that reflected the glow of traffic lights. I stepped out of the car, my body moving on autopilot, my heels clicking against the pavement as I approached the mailbox. And then I saw it. A manila envelope tucked neatly inside. My name was written across it in block letters. Heart pounding, I yanked it free and strode inside, my hands damp from the cold. I locked the door behind me, kicked off my shoes, and ripped the envelope open. Inside, a stack of papers, bank statements, transactions I never authorized, tens of thousands of dollars moving between accounts, offshore holdings under names I didn't recognize, properties, a second mortgage, a financial trail leading to Ethan and Sophie. My hands shook as I flipped through them, bile rising in my throat. My phone buzzed. I snatched it up, expecting Ethan's name, expecting some bullshit excuse about Chicago and delayed flights and bad service. But it wasn't him. It was another message from the same unknown number. Now you know. What will you do about it? I exhaled slowly, the burn of fury replacing the raw ache in my chest. My fingers curled around the phone, my pulse steadying. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of Ethan's favorite scotch, the one he saved for special occasions, and downed it in one burning gulp. Then I grabbed my laptop. Because if Ethan thought he was the only one who knew how to play this game, he was dead wrong. The numbers blurred as I stared at the screen, my fingers frozen over the trackpad. Offshore accounts, wire transfers under shell companies, fake consulting fees. Ethan wasn't just lying about Sophie, he was laundering money. The realization hit like ice water, shocking me back into clarity. This wasn't just cheating, this was something far worse. Infidelity could ruin a marriage, but this could ruin lives. I sat at our marble kitchen island, surrounded by the sleek, modern space Ethan had insisted on remodeling last year. Stainless steel appliances, pristine white quartz counters, custom cabinetry imported from Italy. Cold, sterile, devoid of warmth. I had once loved this apartment, thought of it as our sanctuary. Now it felt like a crime scene. My hands tightened around the edges of the bank statement spread before me, my pulse thudding in my ears. Transfers to obscure businesses, payments from shell corporations I didn't recognize, money flowing in and out of accounts in the Caymans, Luxembourg, Dubai. This wasn't just a financial betrayal, this was intentional deception, and I had no idea how deep it went. I took a slow breath and grabbed my phone. There was only one person I trusted with something like this. Daniel. The drive to my brother's office was a blur. I don't remember locking the apartment. I don't remember how long I sat in traffic, my grip locked around the steering wheel. But I remember the moment I walked into his building, my heels clicking against the polished floors, my coat still damp from the lingering drizzle outside. Daniel's receptionist barely had time to open her mouth before I pushed past her, storming into his office like a woman possessed. He looked up from his desk, startled. Olivia? I dropped the papers in front of him. Tell me what this means. Daniel frowned, adjusting his glasses as he shuffled through the pages. His office was neat, minimalistic. Leather chairs, dark wood, a wall of books that probably made his clients feel like they were getting billed by the hour just for breathing in the same space. He skimmed the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. Where the hell did you get these? It doesn't matter. Just tell me what I'm looking at. He exhaled sharply, tossing one of the statements onto his desk. Money laundering. The words landed like a punch. Money laundering. I swallowed. Explain. Daniel leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose. These companies don't exist, or if they do, they're shells. Empty entities, designed to move money without drawing attention. The transactions are structured to avoid regulatory scrutiny, but the amounts are too big to be casual. Someone is hiding cash, moving it in and out of accounts, scrubbing it clean. I shook my head, trying to process. Ethan did this? Daniel hesitated, flipping through another page. Ethan is definitely involved, but he's not the mastermind. Someone bigger is pulling the strings. I felt the floor shift beneath me. Bigger. I thought this was about Ethan lying to me, about him betraying me, but this was something else entirely. My voice was barely a whisper. How bad is this? Daniel didn't look up. Bad. I paced the length of his office, my mind racing. Money laundering, fake businesses, offshore accounts. This wasn't some impulsive affair. This wasn't Ethan slipping up, making a mistake. This was planned, calculated. I turned back to Daniel. If Ethan is involved, what happens to him? Daniel gave me a look. If he gets caught? I nodded. Best case? Fines, frozen assets, federal investigation. Worst case? Daniel's expression hardened. Prison. A long sentence. I let that sink in. I should have felt satisfaction at the thought of Ethan paying for what he did, but instead, something else settled into my bones. Determination. I had spent years living in Ethan's carefully curated world, believing the lies he fed me, and I had let him. I had swallowed every smooth excuse, every polished half-truth, because it was easier to believe in our perfect life than to question what lay beneath. But now I was awake, and I was going to burn it all down. I walked to Daniel's desk, grabbed the papers, and started stacking them neatly. He has a gala this Friday. The Plaza Hotel. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Olivia. That's where I start. Daniel exhaled sharply. Jesus, look, I know you're pissed. This isn't about being pissed, Daniel. I met his gaze, my voice steady. This is about knowing the truth. And what if the truth is worse than you think? I shrugged. Then at least I won't be the only one who knows it. I was halfway to the door when Daniel's voice stopped me. Whatever you're planning, don't do it alone. I turned, gripping the doorknob. Who said I was alone? Then I walked out, my mind already forming the next step. I pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for half a second before I typed, "We need to talk," and I sent it to Sophie. The cafe Sophie picked was small, unremarkable, the kind of place where no one looked too closely, where people kept to themselves. It wasn't our usual spot. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I spotted her immediately, tucked into a booth near the window, fingers wrapped around a steaming latte. She was trying to look composed, but her hands were trembling slightly, her nails clicking against the ceramic cup every time she moved. She was already afraid. Good. I walked over, slid into the seat across from her, and set the bank statements on the table between us. Sophie's gaze flicked to the papers, then to me. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of what I knew settle in the air between us. Finally, I said it. "Tell me you didn't know." She flinched. For a moment, I saw the version of Sophie I used to trust, the girl who used to steal my fries when we were kids, the woman who stood beside me on my wedding day, the friend who was supposed to be forever. Then, just as quickly, that version of her vanished. Sophie's face drained of color. Olivia, I didn't let her finish. I tapped the stack of papers, my nails drumming against the inked proof of her new husband's criminal empire. Ethan isn't just cheating Sophie. He's laundering money. He's committing fraud. I gestured to the bank statements, my voice even. This is bigger than you and me. Sophie stared at the documents like they might explode. You think I knew about this? Did you? She looked up sharply, eyes wide. No, of course not. I leaned back, studying her. Then explain something to me. She exhaled shakily. What? I folded my hands on the table. Why is Ethan controlling your accounts? Sophie blinked. He's not. I didn't react, I just watched. Her hands tightened around her cup. She hesitated, then grabbed her phone from the table, unlocking it with a quick swipe. Her fingers moved fast, too fast, scrolling through her banking app, pulling up her accounts. And then she froze. I knew before she even said a word. Her access was gone. Sophie's breath hitched. She tapped again, and again. Her jaw tightened. This isn't... She stopped, shaking her head. I kept my voice soft. What does it say? Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since I sat down, I saw it. Real fear. I don't have full access. A small, bitter smile touched my lips. There it is. Sophie sat back, her phone still clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. Why would he do this? Why would he? Because it was never about love, Sophie. I leaned in, my voice like steel. It was about control. She inhaled sharply. No, that's... What? I tilted my head. Crazy? Unbelievable? Because that's what I told myself too when I started seeing the cracks. But look around, Sophie. Do you really think Ethan married you out of devotion? Her breath shuddered out of her. She looked down at her lap, shaking her head. And then, her phone buzzed. I saw it, so did she. A message. From Ethan. Don't talk to her. Go home now. I didn't move. Sophie didn't either. For a long, suspended moment, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, she turned her phone around so I could see it, as if she needed me to confirm what she already knew. I met her gaze, my own chest rising and falling steadily. Sophie's lips parted, a sharp exhale leaving her like she'd just been sucker punched. She knew. She finally knew. I leaned forward. Now, do you believe me? Sophie's grip on her phone trembled. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the glass screen. She didn't answer for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said it. What do we do? I smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. We burn his entire world down. Daniel's office smelled like old books and fresh coffee, but right now it felt more like a war room. The papers were spread across his desk, bank statements, shell company filings, offshore account details. I had spent the last hour watching him cross-reference each transaction, his brows furrowed in deep concentration. I was good at reading people, and right now, even he was rattled. I leaned forward, tapping my nails against a document. It's not just Ethan. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. It's not. I didn't need him to say it. I already knew. Victoria Reynolds. I had suspected it the moment I saw the money trail. There was no way Ethan could pull off something this complex on his own. He was always ambitious, but never brilliant, never careful enough to orchestrate something this elaborate without help. But his mother? That was another story. But before I came to Daniel, I had to be sure. I had spent the last 24 hours combing through every detail, tracing transactions, decrypting hidden financial records that weren't meant to be found. Sitting in the dark of my apartment, laptop screen illuminating the evidence that shattered the last of my naivety, I followed the money. Overseas accounts, fake invoices, transactions disguised as business expenses. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I broke into Ethan's office. I knew the code. Of course I did. 7 years of marriage leaves its mark in ways you don't always realize. The office was sleek, minimalist, devoid of warmth, much like the man himself. I ignored the framed awards and expensive whiskey collection and went straight to the desk. The locked drawer was an insult, like he thought I wouldn't dare. I dared. Inside, I found a second phone. Not his personal one, not his work one. A burner phone. My stomach twisted as I flipped through messages. Coded transactions, meeting locations, names I didn't recognize but knew better than to ignore. And then the final message. Victoria wants an update. Make sure she gets it. My blood ran cold. So when I slid the thick folder toward Daniel, it wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was proof. He flipped it open, skimming the private investigator's report. Corruption, political ties, boardroom deals that disappeared in legal loopholes. Victoria Reynolds wasn't just laundering money. She was running an empire built on lies. And then I saw it. A name, a date. William Reynolds. 10 years ago, Ethan's father, his suicide. The breath left my lungs. I looked up at Daniel. Tell me you're seeing this. He nodded, his jaw tight. I already pulled the records. He reached for another folder, flipping it open to a court file. Sealed. I stared at it. How did you get this? Daniel didn't answer, and that was answer enough. I scanned the documents, my pulse hammering. The autopsy report, the cause of death, undetermined, not suicide, inconclusive. I forced myself to breathe. Victoria covered this up. Daniel exhaled slowly, and if you keep digging, she'll bury you too. The air in the office felt heavy, like the walls were closing in. Victoria wasn't just protecting Ethan, she was orchestrating him. How deep did this go? How much did Ethan know? And then, something shifted. A prickle of awareness at the back of my neck, that gut feeling you get when someone is watching you. I turned toward the window. Just beyond the glass, the city stretched in endless lights, the hum of Manhattan pulsing beneath us. But it wasn't the city that sent a chill down my spine. It was the black car parked across the street, the one that had been there when I arrived, the same one that had been outside my apartment last night. I swallowed hard. Daniel saw my expression. What? I turned back, forcing a steady breath. Nothing. My phone buzzed, an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Hello? A voice, low and steady. You're in over your head. Walk away. A warning, a threat. I tightened my grip on the phone. Who is this? The call cut off. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat a drum against my ribs. Daniel was watching me. You need to stop. I met his gaze, voice like steel. Not a chance. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove aimlessly through Manhattan, my mind racing. I thought of Ethan standing at that altar, smiling like he hadn't shattered my world. I thought of Sophie, clutching her phone in that cafe, realizing she had never been in control. And now, I thought of Victoria, the real mastermind. My phone buzzed again, a message from Sophie. Tell me everything. I exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel. Good, because the game was just getting started. The Plaza Hotel was a palace of illusions. Gleaming chandeliers, a sea of designer gowns, the scent of wealth hanging in the air like expensive perfume. Waiters glided through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne, their movements rehearsed and seamless. The city's elite gathered under the golden glow of the ballroom, clinking glasses, whispering alliances behind forced smiles. At the center of it all stood Ethan Reynolds, my husband, my betrayer, the guest of honor. From my vantage point on the balcony, I watched as he stood on stage, basking in the glow of admiration. His tuxedo was crisp, his smile effortless, his posture that perfect blend of power and charm. He raised his glass, nodding toward the woman at his side, Sophie, his wife. Her smile was frozen, a practice mask, but her eyes searched the crowd, searching for me. I let the moment stretch, let the tension coil in my chest before I stepped forward, just enough for her to see me. Sophie's breath caught, her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute, and just like that, the mask cracked. Checkmate. I descended the grand staircase with measured steps, weaving through the crowd as the applause swelled. I felt eyes on me, some familiar, some curious. But only one gaze truly mattered. Victoria Reynolds. She stood near the back of the room, watching me, the corners of her lips curved into something that almost resembled amusement. I barely had time to register her approach before she was next to me, her voice smooth as silk. Enjoying the show? I turned, meeting her gaze head on. I prefer the encore. She laughed softly, the sound practiced, like she had spent years perfecting the art of appearing untouchable. You never did know when to quit, did you, Olivia? I smiled, but it was all teeth. Neither did your son. Her expression barely flickered, but I caught it. The microsecond of tension in her jaw, the slightest shift in her posture. I was getting to her. Good. A waiter passed, placing a fresh napkin on the table beside me. I barely noticed until my eyes caught the single line scrawled in ink. Check your phone. My pulse spiked. I reached into my clutch, pulling out my phone with practiced ease. A new message, unknown number, a voice memo. I pressed play. Victoria's voice, clear and cold. Handle her, I don't care how. The room around me seemed to blur, the sound of clinking glasses and muffled laughter turning into white noise. She had just put a hit out on me. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself before looking up. Victoria was still there, sipping her champagne like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just ordered my disappearance. I took a step closer, close enough that only she could hear me. Your move. She tilted her head slightly. the smallest sign of interest flickering behind her eyes. "How very bold of you," she mused, swirling her champagne in slow, deliberate circles. "But tell me, Olivia, do you really think you've won?" I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone again. With a few taps, I sent a pre-scheduled email. Victoria's own voice rang out from the speakers of the grand ballroom. "Handle her. I don't care how." The sound sliced through the hum of conversation, turning heads, making the whispers swell into a stunned silence. For the first time, Victoria's mask slipped. It was barely perceptible, just the tightening of her grip around the champagne flute. But I saw it. Checkmate, indeed, but I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone again, my fingers moving swiftly as I typed. To Daniel, "It's time. Pull the trigger." But this wasn't the first message I had sent tonight. Hours before stepping into this ballroom, I had already delivered a copy of all the financial evidence to an investigative journalist and a high-ranking federal prosecutor. I made sure there was no undoing this. No amount of money or influence could sweep this under the rug. Victoria's gaze flickered toward the entrance, and just like that, the doors slammed open. A swarm of FBI agents flooded into the room, their presence shattering the polished illusion of wealth and security. The murmurs turned into gasps. Gasps turned into chaos. I stayed still. I had been waiting for this moment. From across the ballroom, I saw Ethan. His face went white, the panic creeping in even as he tried to mask it. His hand tightened around Sophie's wrist like he could somehow physically hold on to the world that was slipping through his fingers. He was good at pretending, but not good enough. A lead agent stepped forward, his voice firm and unyielding. "Ethan Reynolds, you are under arrest." The words sliced through the air like a gunshot. Ethan barely had time to react before two officers yanked him off the stage. The microphone tipped over, sending a sharp, grating screech through the speakers. But then, something I hadn't accounted for happened. He ran. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't planned. But Ethan, in his desperate attempt to escape the inevitable, shoved past an agent and bolted toward the back entrance. I moved before I even thought about it. I chased after him, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. But Ethan wasn't running alone. I barely caught a glimpse of the man who grabbed him, a tall figure in a dark suit, his face shadowed. It wasn't one of the agents. It wasn't security. And then they disappeared through the back doors. The agents hadn't seen it. They were still swarming the ballroom, arresting key players, securing evidence. But I saw it. And I knew, in that moment, this wasn't over. Not yet. The lights flickered once, twice. Then the room plunged into a stunned silence. A hush rippled through the ballroom. Champagne glasses froze mid-air. Conversations cut off like someone had sliced the air with a knife. The orchestra stumbled to a stop, the elegant hum of music replaced by the sudden, jarring presence of something much heavier, something inevitable. Then the doors slammed open. A swarm of FBI agents flooded into the room, their presence shattering the polished illusion of wealth and security. The murmurs turned into gasps. Gasps turned into chaos. I stayed still. I had been waiting for this moment. From across the ballroom, I saw Ethan. His face went white, the panic creeping in even as he tried to mask it. His hand tightened around Sophie's wrist, like he could somehow physically hold on to the world that was slipping through his fingers. He was good at pretending, but not good enough. Victoria Reynolds did not flinch. While the rest of the room twisted into a frenzy, she remained perfectly still, perched in her seat like a queen, watching a battle she already knew she would win. An agent stepped forward, reaching for Ethan. "Ethan Reynolds, you are under arrest." The words sliced through the air like a gunshot. Ethan barely had time to react before two officers yanked him off the stage. The microphone tipped over, sending a sharp, grating screech through the speakers. He thrashed, but it was useless. I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Ethan's eyes locked onto mine, desperation flickering in them. "Olivia, please, you don't understand." I tilted my head. "Oh, I understand perfectly." The room felt like it was closing in, But Victoria? She still didn't move. As the officers cuffed Ethan, she finally turned to me, her voice like silk. "You think this is over?" I let out a slow, measured breath. "No, Victoria. I think it's just beginning." Ethan's voice broke through the noise. "It wasn't me. I was following orders. It was my mother." A laugh bubbled up in my throat, but I swallowed it. Of course he would sell her out. Coward. But I wasn't done. I took a step closer, forcing him to look at me. "And what about Sophie? What about me?" Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. He had nothing. And then, for the first time that night, Sophie spoke. Her voice was quiet but strong. "I was your trophy, wasn't I?" Ethan flinched. Sophie had been his perfect prize, his backup plan, his insurance policy, and now, she was something he could no longer control. Victoria finally rose from her seat. She adjusted her gown, smoothing a hand down the shimmering fabric. When she spoke, her voice was light, almost amused. "This isn't a courtroom, dear. Do you really think the government can touch me?" The room buzzed with whispers. "She's untouchable. She's too powerful. She'll walk. She always walks." Victoria smiled, stepping closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "You think I didn't prepare for this?" I smiled back. "Oh, I counted on it." And then Daniel stepped forward. He wasn't just carrying legal files. He was holding a USB drive. "Actually, we can." His voice was even, calm, unshaken. "You should really be more careful with your records." Victoria's expression faltered, just for a second, but I saw it, and she knew I saw it. I leaned in, lowering my voice to a whisper. "Checkmate." The agents moved fast. Victoria Reynolds, the queen herself, was handcuffed in front of the entire ballroom. And for the first time, her mask cracked. Her fingers trembled. Not much, but enough. Enough for me to see that she knew. This time, she wouldn't walk away. But as they led her toward the exit, my gaze flickered to Ethan. No cuffs. He was still free. And then, like he could sense my thoughts, Ethan turned. And he ran. The air was thick with the scent of desperation. I chased Ethan through the dimly lit back halls of the plaza, my heels echoing against the polished floors. He wasn't running like a man with a plan. He was running like a man who had nothing left to lose. I had seen him confident. I had seen him smug. I had even seen him cruel. But this was fear. He turned a corner sharply, his shoulder slamming into the wall, leaving a smudge of sweat on the pristine white paneling. His breath was ragged, his suit disheveled, the perfect image of Ethan Reynolds, Wall Street darling crumbling into dust. A storm rumbled outside. The air crackled with electricity. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the narrow hallway in brief bursts. He wasn't going to make it out of this, but he was still trying. Then, another shadow moved ahead of him. Not a cop, not an agent. Someone waiting. Ethan skidded to a halt, eyes widening as the figure stepped into view. A man in a dark suit, his face half lit by the flickering emergency lights. I stopped too, heart pounding, watching as realization dawned on Ethan's face. "You," Ethan breathed. The man didn't respond. He just reached into his coat. Ethan reacted before I could. He bolted through the emergency exit, shoving the door open and disappearing into the storm. I followed without hesitation. The rooftop stretched before us, slick with rain. The city sprawled below like a kingdom of blinking lights. Ethan stood at the edge, breathing hard. I walked toward him, slow, deliberate, unafraid. The man in the suit followed, silent, unshaken. Ethan turned to face me, water dripping from his hair, his chest rising and falling as he wiped a shaking hand across his mouth. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Was it worth it?" I didn't hesitate. "Every damn second." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You never really loved me," he said, his voice laced with something between bitterness and disbelief. "You loved the power." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I let out a soft chuckle. "That's rich, coming from you." His jaw clenched, his body tensed, and then he lunged. I barely had time to react before he crashed into me, knocking us both against the slick rooftop. My elbow scraped against the wet concrete as I twisted, shoving him back, but he was stronger than I remembered. The storm raged around us, wind whipping at my dress, rain soaking through the fabric. Ethan's hands curled around my wrists, pinning me down for a split second before I drove my knee into his stomach, forcing him off me. He stumbled, panting, hands shaking, and then he reached into his coat. I froze. A gun. The world slowed. He held it steady, the barrel aimed at my chest. His eyes were wild, frantic, but I just stared at him, unblinking. "Go ahead," I murmured, my voice steady. "Do it." His grip tightened. His finger hovered over the trigger. "You and I both know Victoria isn't coming for you," I whispered. His breath hitched. I took a slow step forward. "She sent someone else, didn't she?" Ethan's eyes flickered toward the man in the suit, just for a second, but I saw it. Doubt. And that was all I needed. "You think she's going to protect you?" I tilted my head, voice cutting through the storm. "I have proof, Ethan. I have the documents, the recordings, everything. You're just a loose end to her now." Ethan's hands trembled. His breathing grew shallower. And then he laughed, a sharp, broken sound swallowed by the wind. "You think I don't know that?" he whispered. "You think I don't know exactly how this ends?" For the first time, I saw it. Ethan wasn't just scared. He was done. He had nowhere left to run, no cards left to play. And then, the sirens. Police lights flickered below. The sound of officers storming through the hotel reached us, distant but closing in fast. Ethan's gaze flickered between me and the city below. His escape was gone. His power was gone. His last move? A bluff. I saw the exact second he realized it. His fingers twitched. And then, the man in the suit stepped forward, and Ethan spun, gun raised. The shot rang out, but it wasn't mine. Ethan stumbled backward, clutching his chest, a clean shot, right through him. His lips parted, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth as he stared, not at me, but at the man in the suit. Betrayal. He hadn't been shot by an officer. He'd been shot by his own side. His knees buckled. He crumpled onto the wet rooftop, gasping for air. I stood frozen, staring as Ethan Reynolds, the man who built an empire on lies, on money, on deception, died on the cold concrete. The man in the suit lowered his gun. His voice was flat. "Orders from Victoria." I swallowed hard, my pulse a steady drumbeat against my ribs. She never intended for Ethan to walk away from this. And then, before I could say another word, the man disappeared into the shadows. The rooftop door burst open behind me, and within seconds, officers were swarming. But Ethan barely reacted, because he was already gone. I crouched down, leaning in close. "Goodbye, Ethan." His lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. "You're just like me." I smiled. That's why I won. The headline screamed from every screen, every newspaper, every whisper in the city. The fall of the Reynolds dynasty. Victoria Reynolds, convicted. Ethan Reynolds, dead. The empire they built, ashes. And me? I was just sitting in my apartment staring at an old wedding photo. A half-empty bottle of Ethan's favorite scotch sat on the counter, untouched. The glass beside it was still full, condensation pooling at the base. I should have felt triumphant, victorious, like I had won. But all I felt was the weight of the past. I picked up the frame, running my fingers over the glass. Ethan, Mr. Sophie, frozen in time, smiling, believing in something that never really existed. I wanted to feel anger. I wanted to feel hatred. Instead, all I felt was tired. A knock at the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I hesitated before standing, crossing the room in slow, deliberate steps. When I opened it, Sophie stood there, her expression uncertain, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She didn't speak right away. Then finally she held up something small, something familiar. A camcorder, old, scratched. From our college days. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Back when Ethan was just a boy we both loved. I stepped aside. She walked in. We sat on the floor, the camcorder between us. Sophie pressed play. The screen flickered, and suddenly we were young again. The three of us sprawled across a dorm room floor, laughing, talking about dreams that felt infinite. Ethan behind the camera, capturing it all, capturing us. Before the lies, before the betrayal, before the war. For a few fleeting moments, we weren't enemies. We weren't survivors of the same wreckage. We were just kids. Sophie's fingers hovered over the buttons, her shoulders stiff. She pressed pause. The screen froze on a younger version of me. My head tilted back in laughter. Sophie beside me, rolling her eyes at something stupid Ethan had said. I stared at it for a long time. Then I whispered, "He didn't destroy us, you know." Sophie swallowed, her voice barely above a breath. Then what did he do? I looked at her, really looked at her. Then I said the truth. He showed us who we really were. I stood, walking over to the fireplace. The past didn't own me anymore. I grabbed a box from the shelf, old letters, photos, remnants of a life that no longer existed. I tossed it into the flames. Sophie hesitated. Then, slowly, she picked up another stack of memories, notes, pictures, fragments of who we used to be. She threw them in. The fire flickered, eating away at the past, turning it into nothing. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We didn't need revenge anymore. We had something better. Freedom. As the flames burned, I finally smiled. Some things, I whispered, are worth burning for. But I wasn't done. This wasn't just about letting go. It was about what came next. I turned to Sophie. "What do you want to do now?" She blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" I sat down across from her. "We just burned the past. Now we decide the future." Her fingers tightened around the edge of her sweater. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought maybe this would feel like an ending. But it doesn't, does it?" I shook my head. "Number? It feels like a beginning." Sophie exhaled slowly. "What about you? What's next for Olivia Hayes?" I let the question linger. Then, for the first time in a long time, I knew the answer. I'm going to make sure no one like Victoria Reynolds ever wins again. Sophie frowned. "You mean?" I nodded. "I know how people like her operate. I know their weaknesses, their patterns. Someone has to be there to stop them before they ever get as powerful as she did." Sophie studied me. "So you're going after them?" A slow smile spread across my lips. "Number, I'm getting ahead of them. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about power, the right kind, the kind that protected people instead of destroying them." 3 days later, I got a letter. No return address, no markings, just a single sheet of paper inside. I unfolded it, my pulse steady. One line. "Con gaio ki quata, quoc choi chi vois moi bat jiao." A chill crawled up my spine. Victoria. I glanced out the window. The city stretched before me, alive and restless. I didn't know where she was, or how deep her reach still ran, but I knew one thing for sure. I was ready. Life has a way of testing us in ways we never expect. Betrayal, deception, and loss, they can break us if we let them. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. We are not defined by what happens to us. We are defined by what we do next. For years, I believe love was built on promises, on words whispered in the dark, on the illusion of forever. But love, real love, isn't about perfect vows or grand gestures. It's about truth, and truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried. Ethan thought he could build an empire on lies. Victoria believed she was untouchable. They both learned that power isn't about control. It's about integrity. And when that integrity is gone, the foundation crumbles. I won, not because I played the same game they did, but because I changed the rules. So ask yourself, what do you hold on to that no longer serves you? Are you chasing revenge, or are you fighting for something greater? When everything falls apart, who will you choose to become? Let this story be a reminder. You are stronger than your past. You are more than the pain you've endured, and sometimes the greatest victory isn't about getting even, it's about getting free. Now I want to hear from you. If this story resonated with you, drop a fire in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. If you disagree with Olivia's choices, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done differently? And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. Because trust me, this is just the beginning. Subscribe now and be part of the conversation. See you in the next one. Blast off.